What if I told you that some of the most famous stories from World War II are flat out wrong? That the invincible Japanese super fighters you've heard about were actually flying death traps, and that one of the most celebrated German generals was mostly a creation of propaganda? For decades, our picture of the biggest conflict in human history has been painted by Hollywood movies, oversimplified history books, and sometimes pure fiction. We see the grainy footage, we hear the famous speeches, and we think we know the story. But a lot of what we think we know is just plain wrong. And these aren't just tiny mistakes. These are huge myths that have twisted our understanding of how the war was fought, who the real heroes and villains were, and what it actually took to win. They were convenient stories told to boost morale during the war or to serve a political agenda after it. Today, we're not just correcting the record, we're going to challenge what you thought you knew about World War II. So get ready, because we're counting down the top 5 WWII myths you probably thought were true. Let's kick things off with a myth that has dominated air combat history for over 80 years.
The myth is a powerful one, born in the fiery skies over the Pacific. It's the image of the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter so advanced, so nimble, that it was seen as an unbeatable superplane. In the first months of the war in the Pacific, the Zero was a ghost. Allied pilots reported with a mix of awe and terror that this thing could outturn anything they had. It climbed like a rocket and seemed to just hang in the air, untouchable. This created the legend of an invincible weapon, a symbol of Japanese military genius that was set to conquer all of Asia. So why did people believe it? Well, because for a while it was basically true. In early 1942, the Zero racked up incredible kill ratios, sometimes 10-to-1 against Allied pilots in older planes like the P-40 Warhawk. These early beatdowns cemented the Zero's reputation. It was a fighter built for one thing: total dominance through maneuverability. To get that, its designers stripped away everything else. The plane was built to be as light as humanly possible. That single design choice, which gave the Zero its stunning early advantage, also sealed its fate. The truth is, the Zero's agility came at a terrifying price. It had almost no armor to protect the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Allied pilots quickly learned that a few well-placed shots from their .50 caliber machine guns could turn a Zero into a fireball. For this reason, it earned the grim nickname the Flying Zippo among American flyers. After a brutal learning curve, Allied tacticians like Lieutenant Commander John S. Tatch developed new tactics to completely neutralize the Zero's edge. The famous Tatch weave allowed two American fighters to work together, covering each other's tails from an attacking Zero. More importantly, American pilots just stopped playing the Zero's game. They refused to get into slow, turning dogfights. Instead, they used boom and zoom. Heavier, more rugged American planes like the F-4 Wildcat and later the F-6F Hellcat would dive on a Zero from above, blasted with a single devastating burst, and then use their speed to climb away, leaving the Zero unable to catch up. Once Allied pilots figured this out, the myth of the invincible Zero literally went up in flames. The plane that was once the hunter became the hunted. By 1944, with better American planes and experienced pilots in the air, the kill ratios had completely flipped. The Zero was a brilliant but deeply flawed design. Its invincibility was just a temporary illusion that vanished the second its weaknesses were exploited. It wasn't a super fighter, it was a glass cannon. Speaking of carefully built images, our next myth is about a man whose legend might be the most successful propaganda campaign of the entire war.
They called him the Desert Fox, the chivalrous warrior of North Africa, the one good Nazi. The myth of Erwin Rommel is one of the most powerful to come out of World War II. The story goes that he was Germany's greatest general, a battlefield genius who fought a war without hate. He was supposedly a man who respected his enemies and was loved by his men, and who wasn't really a true Nazi. Even Winston Churchill praised him in Parliament. So why did this myth catch on? Because it was useful to both sides. For the Nazis, Goebbels used Rommel's early victories in North Africa to turn him into a national hero, a regular guy, not an old-school aristocrat who embodied victory. For the British, building up Rommel's genius helped explain their own embarrassing defeats. It's a lot easier to stomach being beaten by a legendary military genius than just a competent general. After the war, the myth grew with popular books and the publication of the Rommel Papers, which painted him as an honorable figure, separate from the horrors of the Nazi regime. But the truth is a lot messier. While Rommel was a gifted and daring tactical commander, calling him Germany's greatest general is a huge stretch. He was famous for his bold, surprising attacks, but he was terrible at logistics. He constantly outran his supply lines, leaving his famous Afrika Korps stuck in the desert without fuel and water. This recklessness led directly to his biggest defeats, including his ultimate loss at the Second Battle of El Alamein. Strategically speaking, he lost the North Africa campaign. The idea that he was an anti-Nazi good German has fallen apart under scrutiny. While he wasn't a hardcore party ideologue, he gladly accepted the fame Hitler gave him and was the star of Goebbels' propaganda. His connection to the plot to assassinate Hitler was minimal at best. More disturbing is the myth of his war without hate. While historians debate his direct knowledge of specific extermination plans for the Jewish population in Egypt, his forces were involved in using Jewish forced labor in Tunisia, and he was a willing general serving a regime bent on genocide. Rommel wasn't a monster, but he was a servant of monsters. The Desert Fox was largely a mirage. We're just getting started here, and as you can see, the history you think you know is often just the beginning of a story. If you're finding this interesting, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us out, and make sure you don't miss our next video busting historical myths. Now, onto a myth that helped an entire country avoid its past for decades. This next myth is one of the most toxic to come out of World War II. It's the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. The story goes like this. The regular German armed forces, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, fought an honorable war. The real evil, the war crimes and the Holocaust, was all done by the fanatical SS. The average German soldier, according to this myth, was just a patriot fighting for his country, untainted by the regime's genocide. This belief was incredibly important in post-war Germany for a couple of reasons. First, it was a huge psychological comfort. It allowed millions of veterans and their families to separate their military service from the crimes of Nazism. Second, it was politically convenient for the West. As the Cold War started, the US and its allies needed a rearmed West Germany to stand against the Soviet Union. Admitting that the new German army was the direct successor to a criminal organization was a non-starter. So, former German generals happily promoted this myth in their memoirs, blaming everything on Hitler and the SS. However, decades of research have proven this myth to be a flat-out lie. The Wehrmacht wasn't clean. It was an essential tool of the Nazi war of annihilation, especially on the Eastern Front. The SS may have been the main architects of the Holocaust, but their death squads, the Einsatzgruppen, couldn't have operated without the Army's help. Army units provided logistical support and helped round up civilians for mass execution. At Babi Yar, one of the single largest massacres of the Holocaust, Wehrmacht soldiers helped herd the Jewish population of Kyiv to the ravine where they were then shot by SS and police units. And in many other places, Wehrmacht soldiers themselves carried out massacres of Jews and other civilians. This criminality was written into their official orders. Before invading the Soviet Union, the German High Command issued a series of criminal orders, like the infamous Commissar Order. This instructed troops to execute any captured Soviet political commissar on the spot, a direct violation of the laws of war. Another decree basically gave German soldiers a license to kill any Soviet civilian they suspected of resisting. And it was the army that was directly responsible for the deaths of over 3 million Soviet prisoners of war through deliberate starvation and murder. The Wehrmacht wasn't a separate, honorable army. It was deeply and systematically involved in the worst crimes of the 20th century. From a myth of morality, we now turn to a myth of concrete and steel. It was called Fortress Europe. Nazi propaganda films showed a terrifying, continuous wall of massive concrete bunkers and giant coastal guns stretching for thousands of miles. The beaches were shown bristling with mines and obstacles. The myth of the Atlantic Wall was that it was an unbreakable fortress that would crush any Allied invasion before it even started. The source of this myth? Pure propaganda. Hitler and Goebbels needed to project an image of absolute strength to both their own people and the Allies. They wildly exaggerated its power and scale. The giant gun batteries around the Pas de Calais, the shortest point across the English Channel, were definitely real and scary. But that was the problem. The Germans were so sure the invasion would come at Calais that they put their best defenses there. In reality, the Atlantic Wall was mostly a bluff, what one German field marshal later called a propaganda wall. It wasn't a continuous wall at all. It was just a series of strong points concentrated around major ports and, of course, the Pas de Calais. In other places, like Normandy, the defenses were much weaker and often manned by second-rate troops. When Rommel was put in charge of improving the defenses in early 1944, he worked frantically to add mines and obstacles, but there simply wasn't enough time, concrete, or manpower to fortify the entire coast. But the wall's biggest weakness wasn't physical, it was strategic. The Allies pulled off the greatest head fake in military history, Operation Fortitude. They created a completely fake army, the first U.S. Army group, commanded by the famous General Patton. This ghost army had inflatable tanks, dummy ships, and fake radio chatter, all designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion was aimed at Calais. It worked perfectly. Even after D-Day started in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Hitler was convinced it was just a diversion. He kept his most powerful panzer divisions waiting near Calais for the real invasion that never came. That delay gave the Allies the time they needed to secure a foothold. The Atlantic Wall wasn't just smashed by force, it was outsmarted. Our final myth is a beloved story of national heroism, but the truth is a story of industrial-scale naval power. It's one of Britain's most cherished stories from the war. It's 1940, and the British Army is trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, about to be wiped out by the Germans. Then, a miracle. A huge fleet of civilian little ships, fishing boats, yachts, and ferries sails from England to rescue the soldiers. It's a story of everyday courage turning a massive military disaster into a miracle of deliverance. This myth took hold instantly because it was an amazing morale boost at Britain's darkest hour. Churchill himself called it a miracle, and the story of the little ships became a powerful symbol of a nation pulling together. The image of a civilian in his yacht saving soldiers was the perfect David and Goliath story. But it's a huge distortion of what really happened. While the little ships were incredibly brave, they didn't rescue most of the army. The evacuation, called Operation Dynamo, was a massive Royal Navy operation. Of the 338,000 Allied soldiers rescued, the vast majority, about 2/3, were taken directly from the harbor's long stone pier, the Eastern Mole, onto Royal Navy destroyers and other large ships. So what did the little ships do? Their role was vital, but it was mostly as a shuttle service. The Dunkirk beaches were too shallow for big warships to get close to shore, so the little ships, many of them requisitioned by the Navy and crewed by sailors, acted as water taxis, ferrying thousands of soldiers from the beaches out to the Royal Navy destroyers waiting in deeper water. It was a dangerous job under constant air attack. The idea of a spontaneous civilian-led rescue is inspiring, but wrong. The operation was a masterpiece of military planning, with the little ships acting as one crucial part of a much larger professional machine. And the miracle only happened because of two other key things. First, the French First Army fought a heroic rearguard action that held up the Germans for crucial days. Second, there was Hitler's infamous halt order, which stopped his panzer tanks just miles from Dunkirk, giving the Allies time to organize the evacuation. Dunkirk is not a simple story of a civilian miracle. It's a complex story of a professional naval operation, a heroic defense, a colossal enemy mistake, and undeniable courage. The little ships were heroes, but the Royal Navy's destroyers did the heavy lifting. So there you have it. 5 huge myths about World War II. From propaganda generals and fragile superfighters to a supposedly clean army and a concrete wall that was mostly for show. History is never as simple as the stories we tell ourselves. It's messy, complicated, and often uncomfortable. By looking past the myths, we get a clearer, more honest picture of what that generation truly faced. The truth, in the end, is always more interesting than the fiction. What other WW2 myths do you think need to be debunked? Let us know in the comments below. We read all of them. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. We'll see you next time.